Revenge is not some flashy movie you watch on a Saturday night. It is quiet. It feels like swallowing a freezing ice cube and carrying it in your gut for years. They looked at me, a woman in civilian clothes at 42, and saw easy prey wandering into a wolf pack. They did not realize the only prey in that briefing room was the smirking colonel. When the Admiral finally spoke the name Iron Hawk, his smile vanished forever. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Sydney Lopez. I am 42 years old, and on that particular morning, I was driving through a torrential downpour toward Fort Obsidian Tactical Base. The rain battered the windshield of my car in a relentless, punishing rhythm, washing away all color from the world until everything outside matched the grim, oppressive gray of the eastern seaboard. Fort Obsidian was not a place of honor or glory. It was a monolithic concrete fortress, a brutalist monument to wars fought in the shadows and secrets buried in the mud. I wore plain civilian clothes, a simple dark jacket and tailored slacks, blending in perfectly with the dreary background. I looked like a mid-level administrative assistant or a weary logistics clerk. That was exactly the point. There was not a single trace left on my person to suggest I was once an operative for the Covert Vanguard Operations Bureau. The DCVO was a phantom organization, a myth to the general military population, but a waking nightmare to the few who truly understood the depth of its operations and the absolute lethality of its agents. I walked through the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the complex. My footsteps were completely silent, an old, deeply ingrained habit that refused to die. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the main briefing room, the air inside was thick with arrogance, testosterone, and the bitter scent of stale black coffee. There were over a dozen men gathered around a massive mahogany table. High-ranking military officers, intelligence analysts, and a seasoned detachment of Navy SEALs. They were apex predators in their own minds, wolves pacing confidently in a steel cage. My eyes, hardened by countless hours spent staring down the high-powered scope of a sniper rifle, swept the large room in a fraction of a second. I automatically categorized every possible exit, measured every structural blind spot, and evaluated every single man in the room as a potential tactical threat. My cold gaze stopped at the head of the table. Colonel Marcus Thorne. He sat there leaning back comfortably in his expensive leather chair, swirling dark coffee in a ceramic mug. He radiated the insufferable, suffocating arrogance of a man who had never tasted the bitter ash of true defeat. His uniform chest was heavily decorated, a colorful metallic display of ribbons and medals that caught the harsh overhead light. To the untrained eye, he was a decorated, fearless war hero. To me, looking through the lens of a devastating past, I knew exactly what those medals were. They were forged receipts. They were bought and paid for entirely with the spilled blood of better, braver men. The low murmur of deep voices and the rustle of briefing papers slowly dwindled into an uncomfortable silence as they finally registered my presence standing near the doorway. Thorne set his mug down on the table, a condescending, ugly smirk slowly spreading across his clean-shaven face. He looked me up and down, taking in my unassuming civilian attire, my 42 years of quiet existence, and my gender. "Well now," Thorne announced, his voice loud and theatrical enough to ensure every single man in the room was listening. "Did the secretarial pool get lost on their way to the administrative wing? Or did command finally listen to my request and send someone to take the minutes for us?" A few scattered, nervous chuckles erupted from the younger, ambitious officers who were desperately eager to please their commanding officer. Thorne basked in their sycophantic laughter, leaning forward and resting his elbows heavily on the polished wood. "Or maybe," Thorne continued, his tone dripping with thick mock sweetness, You are here to prepare the coffee while the men get down to the actual work? More laughter followed his words. I did not blink. I did not frown. I stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch out. A seasoned sniper knows that patience is the greatest, most devastating weapon. You let the target get comfortable. You let them feel untouchable before you pull the trigger. Before I could offer a single word in response, the heavy doors behind me swung open with such violent force that they banged loudly against the wall stops. Admiral Elias Vance strode into the room. The atmosphere froze instantly. The laughter died abruptly in their throats. The men scrambled frantically to their feet, snapping to rigid, breathless attention. The air grew cold, heavy with the sudden, crushing shift in authority. Vance took 2 long steps in and surveyed the scene. His sharp, calculating eyes darted from the smirking colonel to the young officers trying to swallow their grins, and finally to me, standing quietly near the entrance. The Admiral's face darkened, a violent storm brewing behind his weathered features. He had heard the tail end of the pathetic joke. "Colonel Thorne." Vance's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that echoed threateningly off the walls. "I suggest you apologize to this woman immediately." Thorne blinked rapidly, his arrogant smile faltering for a brief second before he desperately tried to recover his composure. He let out a nervous, breathy laugh, attempting to casually brush off the severe reprimand. "With all due respect, Admiral, it was merely a harmless joke to ease the tension in the room. I did not realize she was a guest of yours." Vance did not accept the weak excuse. He marched straight to the head of the large table. The heavy silence in the room was now deafening. He slammed his open palm down on the mahogany surface with a sharp crack like a rifle shot. The dark coffee in Thorne's mug violently spilled over the rim, staining the papers beneath. "Stand at absolute, rigid attention, Colonel," Vance roared, his furious voice stripping away every ounce of Thorne's false dignity. "She is not here to pour your damn coffee. She is Ironhawk." It was as if someone had opened an airlock and violently sucked every single molecule of oxygen out of the briefing room. The name hung suspended in the dead air, heavy and lethal. Every Navy SEAL in the room physically stiffened, their broad shoulders locking up as their eyes widened in sudden, terrifying realization. They knew the bloody ghost stories passed around late at night in the barracks. They knew the terrifying, whispered legend of the phantom sniper from the Covert Vanguard Operations Bureau, the one who brought absolute ruin from a mile away. Thorne's arrogant, relaxed posture completely collapsed. The expensive leather-bound notebook he was holding slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the polished table with a dull, heavy thud. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him a sickening, lifeless shade of pale gray. He stared at me, his eyes wide and shaking, as he finally realized that his own personal Grim Reaper had just walked through the front door. 8 years ago, the air tasted of copper and burning sulfur. Operation Rusting Night was supposed to be a surgical strike. The target was a sprawling, decayed industrial sector huddled dangerously close to the southern border, a concrete graveyard that had been resurrected by a cartel dealing in black market, high-grade military technology. My twin brother, Matteo, was leading the primary ground assault element. Matteo was the heartbeat of the Vanguard. While I lived in the cold, calculated mathematics of distance and wind shear, he was the fire on the ground, the man who kicked down doors and brought everyone home. I was positioned precisely 1 mile away, perched precariously on a rusting telecommunications tower. The harsh desert wind whipped at my ghillie suit as I pressed my eye to the optic of my customized high-powered rifle. Far away from the dirt and the danger, sitting comfortably in an air-conditioned command center several hundred miles north, was our operation commander, Marcus Thorne. At the time, he was a major, sipping bottled water and watching the encrypted video feeds on glowing monitors, safely removed from the reality of the violence. The intelligence we received was not just flawed, it was a catastrophic fabrication. Command had assured us the sector was guarded by a skeletal crew of low-level smugglers. But the moment Mateo and his six-man element breached the perimeter of the central manufacturing warehouse, the trap violently slammed shut. It started with a blinding flash, followed by a concussive shockwave that rattled the steel beams of my tower. Searing floodlights flared to life, illuminating the courtyard in a harsh clinical glare. Then, the night was completely torn apart by heavy machine gun fire. It was not a smuggler crew. It was a heavily armed, highly trained paramilitary force, and they had been waiting. Lethal tracers lit up the darkness like a swarm of angry hornets, converging entirely on Mateo's pinned-down squad. "Contact! We are taking heavy sustained fire from multiple elevated positions." Mateo's voice cracked through the encrypted communications channel, struggling to be heard over the deafening roar of automatic weapons. "Intel is complete garbage. We are pinned behind the loading docks. We need immediate suppressing fire and an emergency extraction." I did not wait for an order. I slowed my heart rate, exhaled halfway, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy recoil punched my shoulder. 1 mile away, a hostile gunner positioned on a catwalk slumped over the railing. I racked the bolt, acquired a new target, and fired again. Another body dropped. But for every man I put down, 2 more stepped into the firing line. The grim mathematics of the battlefield were brutally turning against us. My barrel was growing blisteringly hot, sending mirages of heat waves across my line of sight. "Command, this is Vanguard Actual," Mateo shouted, his breathing ragged and heavy. "We have multiple wounded. We are completely outgunned. Requesting immediate danger close air support on coordinates Alpha 79er. Get the birds in the air right now, or we are dead." There was a long, agonizing pause on the radio network. The silence from command was heavier than the incoming gunfire. When Thorne finally responded, his voice was chillingly calm, completely devoid of panic or empathy. "Negative, Vanguard Actual," Thorne's voice transmitted cleanly over the network. "Air support is denied. We cannot risk compromising the structural integrity of the main facility. Hold your current position and engage the enemy." "Hold position?" Mateo roared, firing a desperate burst from his rifle. "We are being slaughtered down here. Send the extraction birds, Thorne." "I said hold your position, Captain. That is a direct order." Thorne was not protecting a building. He was protecting a prize. What Mateo and the assault team did not know, what none of us knew except the man sitting safely in his air-conditioned bunker, was that the central warehouse housed a server rack containing a heavily encrypted hard drive. That drive held billions of dollars in untraceable dark web cryptocurrency. Thorne had absolutely no intention of letting an airstrike bury his illicit retirement fund. Through my magnified optic, I watched the sickening truth unfold. As Mateo and his men fought desperately for their lives, drawing every ounce of enemy fire to the loading docks, a second, completely unidentified team slipped through the unguarded rear of the complex. They wore unmarked tactical gear. They were Thorne's private mercenaries, hired ghosts sent to bypass the slaughter, extract the drive, and vanish into the night. My brother was not a soldier to Thorne. He was bait. "Thorne, you son of a bitch! They are flanking us!" Mateo yelled, the panic finally bleeding into his hardened voice. I fired until my shoulder was bruised black and blue, dropping targets with frantic, desperate precision. I adjusted for bullet drop. I accounted for the crosswind. I executed every mechanical perfection I had ever been taught. But a sniper rifle cannot stop a mechanized push. A heavy armored vehicle rolled into the courtyard, its mounted turret swiveling directly toward the crumbling concrete barriers where Mateo's team was bleeding out. "Sid," Mateo's voice came through my earpiece. It was no longer the voice of a commanding officer demanding a sitrep. It was just my twin brother, realizing the bitter, inescapable end. The heavy gunfire around him was an apocalyptic roar. "I am here, Maddie. Keep your head down. I am taking out the gunner," I replied. my voice shaking uncontrollably as hot tears blurred my vision, forcing me to blink them away aggressively, just to see through the glass scope. I aimed precisely for the tiny slit in the turret armor. Suddenly, the communication system emitted a harsh, agonizing electronic screech. A targeted, localized signal jammer had just been activated, drowning out our frequency. Thorn was isolating the battlefield entirely, making sure no more desperate pleas or damning accusations could be recorded on the official logs. Just before the static completely consumed the channel, Mateo's voice broke through the noise one final time. "Hold the sky, Sid." The radio died. Only the dreadful hiss of white noise remained in my ear. I stared through the glass of my scope, trapped a mile away in a cage of sheer helplessness. I watched the heavy turret flash brightly. I watched the concrete barrier shatter into a cloud of gray dust. I watched the brave men I trained with, bled with, and loved get ripped apart by high-caliber rounds. I watched my brother, my other half, fall backward onto the blood-soaked concrete and stop moving completely. I screamed until my throat tore, a raw, animalistic sound of pure, unadulterated agony that was swallowed instantly by the vast, uncaring desert. I kept firing, blindly, mechanically, throwing brass into the dirt until the heavy magazine clicked empty, the hollow metallic sound echoing the sudden, terrifying emptiness inside my soul. The aftermath was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. Marcus Thorne emerged from the ashes of Operation Rusting Night as a tragic, resolute hero who had to make difficult, heartbreaking calls in the chaotic fog of war. He drafted a meticulously forged after-action report that pinned the entire catastrophic failure squarely on Mateo's shoulders, citing reckless tactical decisions and blatant insubordination. The military machine, eager to quickly bury a botched shadow operation, accepted the lie without a single question. Thorne received a glowing commendation and a fast-tracked promotion to lieutenant colonel. I was entirely broken. The Vanguard Bureau offered me a quiet desk job in logistics, a pathetic, insulting attempt to sweep the grieving sister under the rug and keep me quiet. I handed them my rifle, stripped off my tactical insignia, and walked away from the only life I had ever known. I left the Phantom Agency, but I did not leave the ghosts behind. I took the excruciating pain, compressed it into a dark, frozen weight, and buried it deep inside my chest, waiting patiently for the day the ice would finally melt and the blood would demand to be paid. The ghost of my brother returned on a quiet, unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. The mail carrier dropped a small, unmarked brown paper package onto my porch. There was no return address, just my name printed in block letters. I brought it inside, slicing the tape with a kitchen knife. Inside rested a single battered silver chain holding a pair of blood-stained dog tags, alongside a folded piece of paper containing a set of GPS coordinates: 45 degrees, 22 minutes north, 110 degrees, 9 minutes west. I recognized the dents in the metal immediately. They belonged to Mateo. The freezing ice cube I had carried in my stomach for nearly a decade suddenly shattered, replaced by a roaring, consuming fire. Someone out there knew the truth, and they were finally handing me the map. I packed a duffel bag, fueled up my car, and drove cross-country. The journey took me far away from the gray, rain-slicked streets of the East Coast and deep into the brutal, isolating winter of the Montana mountains. The GPS coordinates led me to a dilapidated wooden cabin, half buried in 3 feet of fresh snow. The man sitting on the porch was a hollow shell. Jax had been the finest communications and electronic warfare specialist the Vanguard Bureau had ever produced. Now, he was just a broken man missing his left leg from the knee down, clutching a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey to keep the freezing cold at bay. He did not look surprised to see me. He just offered a sad, crooked smile and invited me inside the dim, messy cabin. "I knew you would come looking eventually," Jack said, his voice raspy from years of neglect and hard liquor. I placed Mateo's dog tags on the wobbly wooden table between us. "Who sent these, Jax? And why now?" I asked. Jax took a long, slow pull from his bottle before meeting my eyes. "I did not send them, Sid. But I know why you are here. I know what really happened that night." He leaned forward, the smell of alcohol and deep regret rolling off him. The signal jammer that cut off our communications and left Mateo's team to die. It was not a cartel trick. I traced the frequency burst right before the system crashed. The jamming signal originated directly from the commander's secure channel. Thorne pulled the plug himself. The room spun. "Why did you not say anything at the debriefing?" Jax barked a dry, joyless laugh. "I gave it a shot, but before I even managed to type out my technical assessment, a pair of suits dropped by my hospital bed. They explicitly warned me that if I ever breathed a word, I'd become another tragic suicide. 2 bullets to the back of the skull. I was a scared kid with an amputated leg, Sid. I took my medical leave and fell off the map." A suffocating quiet settled over the cabin. We were just 2 junked gears from a ruined mechanism. "We need the others," I said softly, but with absolute conviction. Jax nodded. We left the snowy peaks of Montana behind and began a grueling road trip across the vast, unforgiving spine of America, hunting down the remaining fragments of our old life. We drove down to the suffocating, dusty heat of West Texas. We found Elias, our former medical evacuation chopper pilot. The man who used to fly state-of-the-art stealth helicopters under heavy enemy fire was now flying a rusty, coughing crop duster over endless cornfields, barely scraping by on a few $100s a week. His hands, which used to be the steadiest in the military, shook uncontrollably from severe nerve damage and untreated trauma. From there, we headed north to the bitter, freezing night streets of Chicago. We found Sarah. She had been the most brilliant tactical intelligence analyst in our division. Now she was wearing a cheap polyester uniform, working as a night shift security guard in a deserted corporate lobby for $15 an hour. She spent her nights staring at blank security monitors, haunted by the faces of the operatives she could not save. We gathered in a cheap, dimly lit motel room on the outskirts of the city. We were a pathetic sight. A one-legged drunk, a trembling pilot, a hollowed-out guard, and a grieving sister. We were the collateral damage of Marcus Thorne's ambition. We were the soldiers the system had chewed up and spat out. I looked at each of them. Their eyes were tired, defeated, deeply scarred by the past. "Thorne is being vetted for a massive promotion," I told them, placing a thick file of gathered intelligence on the bed. "There is a supreme military tribunal convening in exactly 2 weeks to review his entire operational history. It is a closed-door hearing. It is our only chance." "You want us to testify against a decorated war hero?" Elias asked, his voice shaking. "They will destroy us all over again." "I am not asking you to do this for revenge," I replied, my voice steady and quiet. "Revenge is a poison. I am asking you to do this for a final piece before closing our eyes. We owe it to the men who did not make it out of that desert." Sarah looked down at her cheap security badge, then back up at me. A faint, long-forgotten spark ignited in her eyes. Jax unscrewed his flask, poured the liquor down the sink drain, and set the empty metal container on the table. We made a pact right then and there. We were going to pool the last remaining ounces of our broken strength, walk into the lion's den, and tear down the false, blood-soaked monument named Marcus Thorne. It took exactly 48 hours for the invisible, crushing weight of Marcus Thorne to find us. We were sitting in a roadside diner when Sarah checked her phone and turned deathly pale. Her bank balance, which had held a meager $800, suddenly read exactly 0. Jax pulled out his tablet and found his veteran disability portal permanently locked out. My own emergency credit cards were entirely wiped clean, flagged for severe federal fraud. Thorne was actively hunting us, but he was not using bullets yet. He was using his bureaucratic leverage to starve us out. By noon, a prominent military news outlet published a heavily redacted, anonymous article. It detailed a dangerous, highly paranoid former civilian contractor attempting to extort a respected, decorated military commander. They were painting me as a lunatic. We retreated to the most miserable, forgotten cinder-block motel we could find on the edge of the county line, paying for a single room with the last $95 of untraceable cash we had pooled together. Jax, Elias, and Sarah crashed on the two sagging beds, exhausted from the sheer terror of being hunted by the United States government. I did not sleep. You do not survive a decade in the Vanguard Bureau by sleeping when the enemy knows your general zip code. Thorne thought we were a collection of crippled washouts waiting to be slaughtered. He forgot entirely who he was dealing with. Earlier that afternoon, I had walked into a local, rundown hardware store with $50. I bought heavy-duty zip ties, 2 cans of aerosol hairspray, industrial duct tape, heavy copper wire, and a box of long steel nails. I spent the dark hours of the evening turning room number 7 into a mechanical spider web. I was not going to let Thorne turn me into a murderer on civilian soil. Dead bodies invite local homicide detectives and federal warrants. I needed them alive, but completely broken. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, the freezing rain outside began to mask the subtle crunch of gravel. I sat completely still in the darkest corner of the room, listening intently. There were 4 of them, heavy tactical boots, stepping with practiced, predatory care. They were a Black Ops private military squad, the kind of off-the-books muscle you hire when you want a quiet, completely deniable massacre. They stacked up outside our peeling wooden door, preparing to breach and execute a one-legged man, a trembling pilot, a terrified woman, and me. The door violently exploded inward, the deadbolt instantly shattering off the doorframe. The first operator charged into the dark room, his suppressed submachine gun raised, and his night vision goggles glowing a faint, eerie green. He took exactly 2 steps before his heavy boot snapped the tripwire I had pulled tight across the entryway. The wire ripped the safety pin out of a modified, pressurized aerosol can taped directly to a bare, sparking electrical wall socket. The resulting chemical fireball was blinding and utterly deafening. It did not kill him, but the concussive flash completely overloaded his night vision optics, burning his retinas with a searing white light. He screamed, dropping his weapon and clawing blindly at his face. I moved from the shadows like a sudden, violent gust of wind. I struck the back of his knee with a heavy metal pipe, collapsing his leg instantly, before wrapping my arm around his throat in a flawless, crushing carotid sleeper hold. It took exactly 6 seconds for his brain to starve of oxygen. He went completely limp in my arms. The second and third men rushed through the smoke, confused and completely disoriented by the unexpected resistance. They expected sleeping victims, not a coordinated ambush. I threw a handful of the heavy steel nails directly onto the slick, rain-soaked linoleum floor. The point man slipped, his balance failing entirely. As he fell forward, I stepped directly into his path, driving my elbow with devastating, bone-shattering force straight upward into his jaw. The loud crack echoed through the tiny room. He was unconscious before his body hit the floor. The third man panicked and wildly swung his rifle toward me. I grabbed the hot barrel with my bare hands, twisting it violently to the left, while simultaneously sweeping his legs out from under him. He hit the ground hard. I dropped my knee directly onto his sternum, fracturing at least 2 ribs, and swiftly drove the heel of my palm into the side of his neck, striking the vagus nerve. His eyes rolled back into his head, and he stopped fighting completely. The squad leader, the 4th man, was smart. He stayed out on the rain-slicked walkway, assessing the absolute catastrophic failure of his entire team in less than 30 seconds. He turned to run, to fall back, and report the disaster. I did not let him. I sprinted through the smoking doorway, tackling him straight through the wooden railing of the motel balcony. We crashed heavily into the muddy gravel below. He scrambled for a backup pistol tucked in his waist holster, but I was faster. I locked his arm in an inescapable joint submission, applying agonizing, increasing pressure until his shoulder loudly popped out of its socket. He roared in pain, finally surrendering. I dragged the whimpering squad leader back into the motel room, zip-tying his hands and feet so tightly the plastic cut deeply into his wrists. Jax, Elias, and Sarah were awake now, staring in absolute, breathless shock at the pile of neutralized assassins scattered across the floor. I reached into the leader's tactical vest and pulled out his encrypted satellite phone. I pressed my thumb forcefully against his bruised throat. "Unlock it," I whispered coldly, "or I will break your other shoulder." He frantically punched in a 6-digit passcode. I opened the secure messaging application. Right there, sitting plainly on the glowing screen, was a direct, irrefutable text order from a number I instantly recognized as Thorne's personal line. It was an authorization to liquidate all 4 targets in Room 7. But there was something else. I scrolled higher through the decrypted intelligence dossier the hit squad had been provided. My blood suddenly ran ice cold. The military tribunal scheduled for next week was not a legitimate hearing. Thorne's political allies had secretly restructured the entire court-martial proceeding. They had already drafted fabricated, ironclad evidence proving that Jax, Elias, Sarah, and I were the actual masterminds behind the stolen cartel cryptocurrency. If we walked into that underground bunker at Fort Obsidian, we were not going to testify. We were going exactly into a heavily guarded cage, permanently silenced under the guise of an espionage and treason trial. Thorne had rigged the entire board. I looked at my terrified, battered friends, then down at the groaning assassin bleeding on the cheap carpet. We could not just show up and tell our story anymore. Playing by the rules of the system was exactly how we died. It was time to rewrite the entire game. The subterranean bunker beneath Fort Obsidian was buried exactly 300 feet below solid granite and reinforced concrete. It was an entirely sterile environment, completely devoid of natural light, designed specifically to keep the military's most damning secrets securely locked away from the public eye. The air inside the closed-door tribunal chamber was freezing and smelled faintly of floor wax and ozone. 5 high-ranking military judges sat behind an imposing curved mahogany desk that dominated the front of the room. Admiral Elias Vance sat precisely in the center, his face an unreadable mask of grim duty. Across the polished floor sat Marcus Thorne. He looked absolutely invincible. His dress blue uniform was impeccably tailored, not a single thread out of place, and the heavy cluster of medals on his chest gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. He did not look like a man facing serious charges of treason and murder. He looked like a triumphant king graciously enduring a minor inconvenience. He even had the audacity to offer me a look of deep, patronizing pity as I sat next to my bruised and battered friends. Thorne had brought in a civilian defense attorney, a ruthless, high-priced shark wearing a custom-tailored suit that likely cost more than $10,000. For the first 2 hours of the hearing, this lawyer systematically and brutally dismantled our entire case. He paced back and forth across the floor, his voice dripping with condescension. "What we have here, honorable judges, is a tragic but ultimately manufactured narrative," the attorney declared loudly, gesturing vaguely toward Jax, Elias, and Sarah. These individuals suffered a severe trauma 8 years ago. We acknowledge that. But since that terrible night, they have spent almost a decade spiraling into severe substance abuse and deep psychological decay. One has a documented history of severe alcoholism. Another suffers from acute neurological tremors. They have 0 physical evidence. They have 0 credible witnesses outside their own echo chamber of bitterness. They are simply trying to blame a decorated American hero for the cruel, chaotic reality of war. I watched Admiral Vance shift uncomfortably in his high-backed leather chair. The system was functioning exactly as Thorne's political allies had designed it to. The rules of evidence in this shadow court were rigged, demanding physical proof that Thorne had ensured would never survive the desert. The judges were nodding slowly, swayed by the lawyer's aggressive dismissal of our broken testimonies. Thorne stood up slowly, buttoning his jacket with practiced, theatrical grace. He looked directly at the panel of judges, adopting a tone of deep, manufactured sorrow. "I forgive them," Thorne said, his voice echoing softly off the concrete walls. "It breaks my heart to see the brave men and women of the Vanguard Bureau reduced to this paranoid state. I made the only tactical call I could make that night to prevent further loss of life. I bear the heavy burden of command every single day, but my conscience is entirely clear. I ask this tribunal to dismiss these baseless, desperate charges so these veterans can finally get the psychiatric help they so desperately need." He smiled triumphantly. He was preparing to walk out of that bunker and step into a massive promotion. He thought he had buried the ghosts forever. "Miss Lopez," Admiral Vance called out, his voice heavy with resignation. "Do you have any final statement before this tribunal convenes for a final ruling?" I stood up. I did not argue with the lawyer. I did not scream in frustration, and I absolutely did not shed a single tear. I walked calmly across the polished floor, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silent room, until I reached the heavy wooden witness podium. Built into the center of the podium was a secure digital terminal used for displaying classified tactical evidence to the large screens mounted on the walls. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the battered silver dog tag that had arrived in the mail days ago. I held it up for the room to see. "The defense claims we have no physical evidence," I said, my voice completely cold and level. "They are operating under the assumption that Captain Mateo Lopez died begging for a rescue. But my brother and I shared a very specific language of survival. He knew the Vanguard protocols better than anyone in this room." I gripped the two halves of the metal tag. With a sharp, forceful twist, I snapped the sealed casing apart. Hidden perfectly inside the hollowed-out metal was a tiny, hardened micro-storage drive. To everyone else, the tag had just been a piece of sentimental debris recovered from a battlefield. To me, it was a perfectly preserved black box. I plugged the drive directly into the terminal's universal port. When the jamming signal hit, Mateo realized he was not fighting a cartel, I explained, staring directly into Thorne's suddenly wide eyes. He realized he was standing on a digital gold mine, and his own commanding officer was the thief. In the final 4 minutes of his life, my brother did not waste time screaming into a dead radio. He hardwired his tactical tablet directly into the cartel's primary server mainframe. The massive digital screens behind the judges instantly flared to life. The court's automated security system tried to block the incoming data, but it was useless. "Mateo wrote a dormant Trojan virus," I continued, my voice rising over the sudden, panicked murmurs of the courtroom. "A mirror protocol that infected the local server and copied every single piece of outgoing data routing through the network before the facility was destroyed." On the glowing screens, lines of green code quickly resolved into crystal-clear banking ledgers. The numbers were massive and undeniable. $75 million transferred to a shell corporation in Geneva, I read aloud, pointing at the screen. $42 million routed to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, and $68 million sent to a private trust in Switzerland. All of these transfers were executed precisely at 2300 hours, exactly 5 minutes after my brother's unit requested emergency extraction. And all of these accounts belong directly to a holding company registered under Marcus Thorne. The defense attorney turned ashen, frantically whispering to Thorne, but Thorne was completely paralyzed, staring at the screen in absolute horror. "But my brother wanted to be incredibly thorough," I said softly. I pressed a final button on the console. The courtroom's surround sound speakers crackled with static, and then a crisp, perfectly preserved audio recording filled the room. It was an intercepted communication from the night of the ambush, pulled directly from the cartel's internal network logs. Do not engage the primary target until the crypto asset is entirely secured. The unmistakable, arrogant voice of Marcus Thorne echoed through the silent bunker. Let the vanguard element draw their heavy fire. Consider the assault team expendable. Get the drive and get out. The naked, horrific truth dropped into the courtroom like a live grenade. The audio looped, playing Thorne's treasonous order a second time. The high-priced defense attorney slowly stepped away from his client, physically distancing himself from a man who was now legally radioactive. The IT technicians in the back of the room frantically typed on their keyboards, trying to shut down the presentation. But the entire Fort Obsidian closed network was completely locked out. Mateo's final act of defiance was a digital dead man's switch, and it was entirely unbreakable. The silence that followed was suffocating. The proud, invincible mask of Marcus Thorne shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. His knees buckled, and he collapsed heavily back into his chair. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of lie or excuse, but he just stammered incoherently, gasping for air like a drowning man. Admiral Vance stood up, his face burning with a furious, righteous anger that completely filled the room. He looked down at the pathetic, trembling man sitting at the defense table. "Military police," Admiral Vance ordered, his voice booming with absolute authority. "Secure the doors. Place the colonel in irons immediately." Exactly 3 weeks later, the United States Department of Justice descended upon the remnants of Marcus Thorne's career like a relentless hurricane. With the undeniable financial data and the intercepted audio recordings exposed, his entire network of corruption was uprooted entirely. The powerful political allies who once protected him instantly vanished into the shadows. He was stripped of every unearned rank, stripped of his fraudulent medals, and quickly sentenced to serve the rest of his natural life inside a maximum security federal military prison. I did not attend his final sentencing hearing. People often assume that watching your greatest enemy fall to their knees will spark a wild, euphoric joy inside your soul. They imagine a fiery, triumphant celebration. But the reality of revenge is far different. There was no joy. There was merely a long, exhausted exhale. It was simply the profound sensation of a 1,000-pound boulder finally being lifted off my chest, allowing my crushed lungs to draw in a full breath of air for the very first time in nearly a decade. On a brilliant, sun-drenched autumn afternoon, I walked through the quiet, rolling green hills of Arlington National Cemetery. The air was crisp and peaceful. I was not alone. Walking softly beside me was Jax, navigating the grassy slope with his new prosthetic leg. Beside him was Elias, the old pilot, his hands finally resting steadily at his sides, and Sarah, who walked with her shoulders pulled proudly back. We gathered silently around the pristine white marble headstone bearing Mateo's name. There were no grand speeches. There were no tears of sorrow. Just the gentle rustle of golden leaves falling around us. The broken, discarded soldiers of the vanguard had finally found their peace. I reached out and gently rested my fingertips against the cold, carved stone of my brother's grave. A soft, genuine smile touched my lips. The freezing ice cube in my stomach was completely gone. That night, for the first time in 8 long years, I closed my eyes and slept deeply, entirely free of the smoke, the gunfire, and the terrifying nightmares. A new chapter opened several months later. I stood on the crisp, green tactical field of the Covert Vanguard Operations Bureau training facility. I was wearing a dark, immaculately pressed tactical uniform, the silver insignia of a senior training commander resting heavily on my shoulder. Admiral Vance had asked me to return, not to fight in the shadows, but to build a better future. Standing at rigid attention before me were 36 young, bright-eyed recruits, men and women ready to dedicate their lives to protecting others. I looked into their eager faces, seeing the exact same fierce, untamed fire that had once burned so brightly in my twin brother. "Your training here will be brutal," I told them, my voice carrying clearly across the open field. "Your physical endurance and your tactical awareness will serve as your shield. But you must never forget this absolute truth. Skills will keep you alive, but only honor will let you live with yourself when the war is over." I watched them absorb the heavy weight of those words. The name Iron Hawk no longer belonged to a phantom sniper delivering quiet death from a mile away. It now belonged to a guardian, a teacher, a keeper of the light, ensuring the profound legacy of those who fell in the dark would never be forgotten. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Haley Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.